To that point, every manufacturer that we know that has employed robots has actually increased their employee count because using the robots, they're more efficient. I always think about it as when I was teaching my children to drive. I had to teach the first daughter. And if I could just have taken all of the information that she learned and put it into the second daughter's brain, it would have been a lot easier to sit in that passenger seat and not have to say, whoa.
Okay, we're here with Joyce. Joyce, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey, it'd be great for our audience. Maybe you could take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us how you ended up at Mass Robotics.
Sure. Well, I'm an electrical engineer by trade, went to Cornell University. I graduated and I started my career working for the Navy as a civilian, doing underwater sonar research for the US Navy. That kind of led me to an Air Force position, working for General Dynamics and other defense contractors, working for the Air Force. And then I started the robotics phase of my career probably about a dozen years ago, organizing the robotics cluster for the Mass Tech Leadership Council. The Mass Tech Leadership Council is one of the large tech trade organizations in Massachusetts. They had a robotics cluster that was about 20 companies, and about a dozen years ago, that was growing rapidly. So grew to 60 companies, 80 companies, 120 companies. And then, a bunch of people through one of those meetings got together and said, hey, we should really have kind of a space of our own and a space for robotics companies to come and work together, share ideas, share resources. Hardware and robotics is very capital intensive. The equipment that you need to make things, to test, prototype, and all that was very expensive. The software licenses were expensive. So, a bunch of us came together and we came up with this idea, and the rest is history. Mass Robotics is now, we have about 50,000 square feet, about 75 startups from around the world have come, and they share the space and the resources, and we help them with everything from finding talent to finding funding. So really helping them escalate and grow.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And you have a front row seat, right, on what robotics is doing for the world and the trends. So just curious to get from you, based off of the work that you're seeing done at Mass Robotics. You look out over the next decade. What are some of the major problems that roboticists are trying to solve today?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest trends that we see now are with manufacturing and logistics. Healthcare is coming in as a close second or third. The defense industry has always used robotics, and there's an uptick in that as well. But I'd say the big trends we're seeing now are in manufacturing and logistics and warehousing. And a lot of that COVID helped escalate as well. Mm-hmm. So, people couldn't go into the factories, people couldn't go into the warehouses, and everyone was ordering online. So there's a real need for it. And so, these are problems and areas and challenges that robotics and AI can help with.
Absolutely. And we're hearing a lot, I think, even, the White House is talking more about bringing manufacturing back to the US, right, after decades of outsourcing right, to other countries. And it seems like robotics is central to that conversation. Am I correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we do not have the labor force for working in the factories either. I mean, we look at our manufacturers now, and all of them are suffering from lack of workforce. There's not people that want to go into these manufacturing jobs as is. So still manufacturers are very, very manual, very repetitive tasks. We visited a lot of manufacturers, and the first thing they say is, look at our workforce. There's an aging workforce. These people are working because they don't want their children to have to do the jobs that they're doing. So bringing in some automation and some robotics into the field, one, makes it sexy. It really makes it a lot more interesting for students to go into. So there are programs that are focused on manufacturing now, and that's a major. You can major in manufacturing and supply chain and those types of things. So I think it's getting to be, most manufacturers that we're talking to now have a little innovation group, and those innovation groups are growing. So it's a lot more appealing to somebody to go into manufacturing now, knowing they're going to be working with technology and not just a conveyor belt where they're picking something up and moving something, right? It's much more interesting to think about, how are we going to automate that? How are we going to streamline a process? And to that point, every manufacturer that we know that has employed robots has actually increased their employee count, because using the robots, they're more efficient, right? They're producing more product. Now they need more shipping people, they need more marketing, they need more sales. So really, when you increase efficiency, you're also increasing production, which is increasing the need for more employees. So
yeah. And that's a fantastic point. We see that time and time again. We'll talk in a minute about the fear mongering around, the introduction of new technology and the displacement of human labor. But time and time again, we see that it only scales our abilities and therefore increases demand, increases need. So that's a really great point. Curious, maybe you could help, educate our audience a bit. There's just, so much talk lately about AI, generative AI. And, AI has been around for the last 15, 20 years, machine learning and everything else. And now it's just coming to a head with ChatGPT and generative AI. How has this conversation with AI, could you maybe talk to us about the relationship between AI and robotics? And is it like worlds converging, or should we still continue to think about them on parallel paths?
I think there's always going to be, AI is built into robotics, right? So the actual convergence has been happening for a long time, right? Robotics and robots have sensors, and those sensors are collecting data. The data is coming into the robot, and now something has to be computed because what's the robot going to do based on what they're seeing?
Yeah.
So that's all kind of AI built in, and then the robot is learning as it goes. So it can make a mistake once. It's almost like, I always think about it as when I was teaching my children to drive. I had to teach the first daughter. And if I could just have taken all of the information that she learned and put it into the second daughter's brain, it would have been a lot easier to sit in that passenger seat and not have to say, slow
White
down.
knuckles.
Yes, not so close to the side of the road. And then by the time I got to my fourth teaching, I could have just sat back and had my coffee and let her just kind of drive because she would have learned. So the nice thing about AI and machine learning is that it can be transferred from computer to computer and robot to robot. So it's not like each robot has to learn on its own every single time. So it's nice that that kind of information can be shared. And cloud computing has also made things a lot less expensive for robotics. Now all the computation doesn't have to happen on the hardware itself. It can happen in the cloud. So that's making robots less expensive, which makes them a little bit more palatable for the manufacturers to purchase them, right?
Right. So, going down this path, it's a really exciting time for robotics, really exciting time for AI. I would argue really exciting time for humans at work. But alas, every time that there's big evolutions or big milestones in technology, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So we're seeing so much fear mongering in the media about AI, robots replacing human workers. There was a World Economic Forum report out a couple of months ago. There are other reports that have been released more recently too, estimating maybe in the magnitude of 80 million jobs being displaced by AI alone, never mind robotics. At the same time, the same report talks about 90 million jobs. I would argue it's probably going to be, to your point before, like hundreds of millions of jobs being created. So just curious to get your point of view on, when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's AI, which is artificial intelligence, but then there's IA, right? Intelligence augmentation. Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about, how are robots truly impacting the work, and do you view it as replacement or augmentation primarily?
Good question. How are robots augmenting work is how we like to use it. If you think about a worker on a manufacturing line, and that's all they're doing all day is picking out the pieces down the belt that are, like, let's say, not perfect. It would be so much more empowering for a person to stand behind a robot doing it, and they could actually be overseeing 3 or 4 robots, right? And watching how they're performing. And I think many years ago, before we had tractors, right, 90% of the people in the country were farmers, right? Now we have tractors. I don't see anyone going back and saying, I want to like hand plow a field. Or, when cars came on the scene in the early 1900s, what happened to all of those horse and buggy drivers, right? They were soon out of a job. Were they worried about that? I think the difference between then and now is that now things are happening so much more rapidly, right? Back then, cars, it took years and years before cars were really replacing all of the horse and buggies. Now it's robotics and AI, and it's happening much more quickly. And so how do we educate students to be familiar with them and not worried? Well, if you look around in schools these days, everyone knows how to work an iPhone. Everyone knows how to work an app. And so a lot of what our startups are working on is the interface from the robot to the person to make it easier to use. So a factory worker doesn't need to really understand the ins and outs of a robot. They just need to understand the interface. The interface could be text commands. It could be visual commands where showing the robot and moving the robot arm and showing them what they need to do and then stepping back and letting the robot do it. So a lot of it is going to be monitoring. It's going to be improving processes rather than just standing there day by day or every day doing the same thing. I think that, if we look back to the 1800s when the US education institutions were formed, the public institutions, that was a long time ago. And really, we had people coming off the farms and now becoming educated. They became engineers. Well, those people developed the robots. So maybe now it's time for definitely upskilling of workers, but what can we put into the public school systems that are going to get people ready for these types of jobs and excited about these types of jobs, right? You could be managing 10 robots. What's cooler than that?
Yeah, this brings up a really interesting point, right? And here on the show, we talk about the phenomena, pretty much that as machines continue to take on the more transactional and objective components of work, as you were just talking about, humans are left to tackle the more relational, right, or subjective components. Could you maybe talk about that a little more for me? What are the things that humans are going to be doing? What should we be relying as business leaders on humans more for then?
I think the attributes of a worker that people will be looking to employ are going to be more not so transactional, as you say. The robots are doing tasks, right? Simple tasks that are very repetitive. It's going to be up to a person to be able to really oversee multiple tasks being done and understand where there might be a bottleneck. How could they improve things? So I think it's more a way of thinking of the process and understanding supply chain during that process. And then everything from if you're producing more things now that you have the robots doing them and they're more efficient, how are you going to market differently? Or can you make hundreds of one thing and hundreds of something else? And how can you be shifting the factory around? So I think it's going to be more an overall understanding of the business rather than just the one little niche that you're standing in.
Absolutely.
So I think that is going to be much more empowering for people to really, they'll have to step back and really think a little bit more and not be so trapped in one little job. I just think everything's going to be more meaningful. They're going to have to understand the whole processes. So that, again, should be put somehow into the public education system, right? We should maybe have classes on this, because if we're bringing manufacturing back, we're still going to need a big workforce that wants to go into that field.
Yeah. And there's this, it's pretty exciting because there's a cyclical nature, right, to this. So what's old is new again. It feels like, as you just said, manufacturing is going to be reintroduced. In your view, if you were to think about education, or even career development for that matter, are there specific elements of that you think will be phased out or replaced, or, educational systems, learning development departments should focus more on special areas in light of this?
I think computer science should be a mandate for everybody. I mean, even people going into mechanical engineering and those other things, it's a process and a way of thinking. And I think even in life, it's a life skill. If you think of computer science as an if, then, else statements and the outputs and the consequences, it's basically every part of your life you're doing those kinds of analyses. If I put gas in my car now, when will I have to get gas again? Or there's very simple things you can put into even selecting a school or selecting an apartment, the pros and cons. If I pick this, will my rent be higher? Will I have to drive farther? It's a process and a way of thinking. And I wish every school had that type of class that could teach students to kind of think logically. It's not a mandate. I know a lot of schools are slowly incorporating it, but it shouldn't replace anything either. So I look at schools nowadays, my girls graduated from high school, they still can't sew a button on their shirt. So there are things that were taken away when they're putting in, the higher advanced maths and those types of things. So I just feel maybe we need a year 13. Maybe schools should be 13 years instead of 12. That lets kids and students mature a little bit more, maybe have better idea what they want to do when they go to college. So I have a lot of ideas of how I think, the system should change. I also think, a year or two of community service before going to school is also another thing. So people understand some of what the challenges are of the general public, and maybe they can help solve those problems when they do end up going off to the university. I don't think it should replace anything. So I was speaking to someone once and I said, I think computer science should be a mandate and something you have to take, just like US history.
Yeah.
And then someone said, well, what will it replace? Will it replace a math or will it replace a science? And I said, neither. It's its own thing. It's a new thing. So it's very difficult to change old institutions, right?
Absolutely, it is. Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something that's going to have to come through state by state, or if it could be federally mandated. I don't know.
Just curious, the same principle, at least in the short term, is going to apply to the current workforce, right? Because we like to talk about technology, and there's this concept of like tech companies, and it's like, well, every blue chip company is a tech company now, right? Because we're all using the technology, and so I guess what's considered tech company today is really the bleeding edge, right? So as every company is adopting technology, inherently there's this need, and we talk about like reskilling, upskilling, training, right? What do you think is the best way for businesses to think of that? Because is it the same way you're thinking, like, oh, we should give them computer science education? Like, what's your take on what sort of upskilling and training should businesses be doing?
Well, interesting. If we're talking about upskilling the general public, there's always, there's online classes, but it's not the same online and hands-on. So I guess it's very dependent on the sector you're in, right? So if you're in construction, upskilling would be learning how to remote control a robot that's going to be doing something, excavating or sheet rocking or painting, right? There's robots that do all of that. I think there's going to be always some pushback from the generation that's at a certain age level.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people who are maybe over 55 and 60 would rather retire than upskill. So that's always going to be a little bit of an issue. I think that the younger generation, everybody knows how to use a cell phone. I think if you can use a cell phone and you know how to download an app, you certainly can easily do some upskilling courses or learn things. And I think a lot of it is getting the hands-on experience, again, down at the elementary school level and the high school level, so that when people get into the workforce, they're not so, they don't get so anxious about having to learn something new. But I really think people who are in their 30s and 40s and early 50s, like they should not be, nobody's afraid of technology anymore, really. It's really the older generation. So
absolutely.
As far as upskilling, I think it's learning new interfaces. And a lot of, let's say, the robotics in manufacturers now, there's a lot of companies that are producing robots, right? So they all have different interfaces. I think that's going to be standardized over time. And so if you know how to work one robot and one interface via text commands or visual commands, you're going to be able to go to another factory that has a different kind of robot, but the interfaces will be the same. It's almost like if you get into a car, it doesn't matter if it's a BMW, Mercedes, or Toyota. They all have a steering wheel. They all have a gas pedal. So I think that's going to slowly become more standardized and easy to use.
Before we leave this topic of upskilling and retraining, just curious to get your thoughts, because I've asked a few economists on the show about this. It is clearly something that, people view as something that has to be done, has to get done in order to bridge us in some way, shape, or form. Do you view, because as running a business would easily just be like, well, I could spend money training these people, or I could get someone right out of school and then it saves me that money and we're off to the races. Do you think that businesses have an inherent obligation to upskill, or do you view this as more something that should come from governments, municipalities to upskill?
I think it's actually the responsibility of both the companies and the federal government to help with the upskilling. And part of that is, if you look at the traditional manufacturers, a lot of their employees have been very loyal to them, and they've been there a long time. And so I think, it's incumbent on the manufacturer to upskill and work with their current employees. They're showing up every day. They've been there for years. And I think grabbing someone new out of school instead of upskilling the people that they already have is probably a mistake, because there's a different mindset with the younger generation, right? They're not interested in staying with the same company for a long time. So
Right.
they might not be as, I'd say, as loyal. So I think it's a little bit of both, because you always want to interject and have a mixed workforce. I think
Sure.
that leads to the most amount of ideas that are coming out, right? When I sit in a room with the younger employees that we have, they always have ideas that I would have never thought of, because they're
Yeah.
coming from a different generation. So I think it's still important for us to have both. But I do think that the government, and I know in the state of Massachusetts, we have a lot of this. We have programs that will pay manufacturers to upskill their workers, as long as what they're learning is transportable to another company. And so you're truly investing in the employee and not specifically in just the company. So they want you to be upskilled and be able to move and take your learnings to another place as well. So they're really investing in the people.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I even run into that in my business and talent strategy itself. But it's amazing how many people don't know that their local government offers training reimbursement and things of that nature to
Right.
help move that forward. So thank you for
a lot. Yeah. I was going to say a lot of states have that. So they're
yes.
the MEPs, the manufacturing extension programs. They all have grants that will help match whatever it takes to upskill your employees.
Yeah, really great point. So rooted in a lot of this, right, in change, and that's why like the media loves that, because it creates that fear, which creates the people clicking on those provocative headlines. But this fear really is this continued stigma in the distrust in the employee-employer relationship, right? I even personally go as far to say as I think it's broken. I think it's been broken. How do you respond to that statement? The employee-employer relationship is broken. And what do you attribute to your beliefs?
The employer-employee relationship, I think that really depends on the employer. So I know the way we treat our employees, you have to empower employees. You have to allow them to make decisions and let them stand behind what they're working on. And you have to have gratitude, and you have to praise them, but you also have to let them make decisions, and you have to let them have some ownership. And so even in manufacturing, if you're bringing in a robot, you have to let the employees have a little oversight or overseeing what the robots are doing, and help them select what the robot's going to do. What don't you like to do, right? You ask them, what don't you like to do? That's a really, mundane task. I'm sure you don't like standing there. How about if we got a robot to do that you could work with? So I think it's really up to the employer to make the employees feel comfortable around any kind of technology they're bringing in. We always say that it's probably best not to bring in 20 robots. It's probably best to bring in one and let the employees actually have a little fun with it, dress them, put a Red Sox cap on it, name it so that it feels like it's kind of part of the family. And we always find that the robots that get ushered into a line, when the employees are having fun with it and naming it, and they really learn to accept it, and then they actually ask for another one. Can we get a brother? Can we? So yeah. I think the big relationship between the employee and the employer is always be open with them so they understand why you're making decisions and why you're bringing in technology. You're bringing in technology not to take their job, but to make their job better and to empower them more, right? And make their everyday life better. So you really have to, I think, honesty and being open is the best kind of relationship.
Absolutely. And so as you, like that story you just said about dressing up the robot or introducing it, thinking about this as a spectator of that, thinking, well, wow, what does that say about the performance of those individuals, and how are they measured today, and how are they going to be measured tomorrow when they have this? How do you think you would help a business think about that and performance measurement of the individual, considering the scalability that's introduced from the robots?
Right. So evaluating an individual when you have robots doing the mundane tasks that they used to do. I mean, you used to be evaluated on how much you produced, right? That was, if you could make 10 boxes or something versus 20 boxes, you would get higher evaluation if you made the 20. Bringing in robots to do some of those simpler tasks, I think the overall employee is going to be more judged on how do we make it more efficient. So maybe we're still making 20, but maybe there's no returns because they're actually made perfectly. Or I'm sure they're going to be producing more if they're using robots, but how do they efficiency as far as maybe electricity or using less product, or there's less excess that they have to cut off around the outside of something. So they're using less materials. So it could be less overall cost. So rather than the amount that they're doing, the 20, it's maybe the perfection of those 20, or the less waste of those 20. We were at a shoe factory that was doing the soles of shoes, and they put plastic in something, and they pull something down, the plastic melts and shapes the shoe, the bottom, and then someone has to trim all the extra off. Well, if they were more efficient and they were trimming less off, that would be less rubber that's wasted.
Right.
So I think it'll be measuring a little bit, maybe more efficiency. I think overall, when you employ a robot and the factory workers enjoy working with it, the whole workplace becomes more fun. And maybe they feel less that they're being evaluated on how much they're producing. Now they can maybe be a little bit more at ease and know that they're not being judged on that or evaluated on that.
Sure. So in this, there are always going to be skeptics. And, I know in robotics programs and curriculum now in college, there are courses on ethics, morals. Can you maybe educate us a little bit on the need for that, where that stems from, and how that makes its way into robotics innovation?
Yeah, so the question about ethics comes up a lot in everything from self-driving cars to, robotic surgeries, and then the malicious people that are always going to be out there. So it's a difficult question, because no matter how much good that we're trying to do with robotics and AI, there's always going to be a side of people that are going to be malicious. So I think as part of that, you have to build in cybersecurity super early into your systems, right? Just like in your phones, you don't want someone going into your bank account. That type of security has to be built into robots early. So that's one point of keeping it more secure. But the ethics piece is, that's a difficult one. I know there's a bunch of robot companies that signed a petition that no firearms can be put onto their robots. No weapons can be put onto their robots. But then you go back and would you count a knife as a weapon? What if it's a kitchen robot? They have to have a knife, right? So there's always going to be outliers, but the ethics problem is real. It's a tough one. I know there's a lot of universities that are doing studies on this. Policymakers have to think about it. It's a tough question.
Sure. So over the past few years, we've seen a significant rise in the popularity of freelance, fractional work. Clearly, automation, robotics is creating more opportunities for that, probably especially in spaces that we wouldn't have seen it before. Can you maybe speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have actually some good examples of remote workers. So let's say you have a factory and you have 4 or 5 robots working, and they're each doing a specific task on a conveyor belt. There's always going to be some malfunctions and something to go wrong. Well, they actually now have people who can be remote, who can remote in and teleoperate to fix a robot. So they're offsite, freelance worker, red light, bing, bing, bing comes on, something happened in factory X. They can actually remote in and they can fix whatever the problem is or troubleshoot. There's another one, the former Vigo robot. It's a little telepresence robot. I forget what car manufacturer they worked for, but there's only so many experts in the world that can troubleshoot certain very high-end cars, right? And so there can be one person sitting in Germany, but they can teleoperate or they can remote into, let's say, a dealer somewhere in the US, and they can, plug in like a USB that can give them the errors that they're getting, or the car sends back the error messages. And they can actually walk through somebody who's there and say, okay, lift up the red tab. I can see it now. So experts can be sitting anywhere in the world for a certain type of robot or a certain type of vehicle. Same for, if you think about surgeons, there's a lot of work in the teleoperating of surgeries. And so you can't have a heart specialist in every remote city in Africa, let's say. But if they have connectivity, maybe the expert heart surgeon can be sitting somewhere else and kind of assisting with the surgery. So there's lots of kind of teleoperating, videoing in that can help with working robots.
Fantastic. Awesome. Joyce, this has been amazing content. It's been great. Is there something I didn't ask that you would like to talk about?
The only thing I love to talk about is our STEM education that we do here at Mass Robotics.
Why don't we talk about that? Yeah. Yeah.
So I do feel that STEM education is very important. And we also feel that we're missing a very large demographic of people who don't have access to robots and robotics. And those are mostly the inner cities. So even in our city here in Boston, we have a lot of programs where we bring schools to Mass Robotics, and we'll do a 2-hour session with them where they'll learn about all of the industries that are adopting robots, everything from construction to underwater, drones, medicine, all of the different agriculture. And so we'll give them examples, and then we'll actually have them do a session with us or do a workshop. It can be everything from programming something that's on a blackboard and writing something, to building a drone, to having a competition with little ground robots. So we think that getting kids interested early and getting their hands on things will really go a long ways in kind of promoting them to go a science route. Not that all routes are going to be important. I mean, as I said before, like having more robots in a factory means they're going to be producing more. So you're going to need to be selling more. You're going to be needing people that understand supply chain better. So really we call robotics an enabling technology for all industries. So it's really not an industry in itself. It's an enabler to many industries. So we host a robot block party annually where we have, thousands of people come through. Robots of all types are there. It's for students and families. It's free. We love just bringing students in and getting them excited about the future.
That is fantastic. And thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll make sure to spread the word about it.
Sounds good.